Since 1934, Iowa's farmers have turned to the Iowa Farm Bureau spokesman as their trusted news source. Now, the Spokesman Speaks. Listen in and hear from leading experts on topics important to farmers and agriculture. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our November 15th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler, and today's episode digs into a topic that's really hitting close to home for all of us right now, especially farmers and others who work in agriculture. Of course, I'm talking about supply chain disruptions, and today we're featuring our recent conversation with Dr. Bobby Martens, an Iowa State University economist with expertise in supply chain management. Then, later in this episode, we'll bring in Iowa Farm Bureau's Farmer Education Program Manager, Ed Kordick, to introduce a new series of webinars to help you elevate your crop marketing game. But we'll start with Dr. Bobby Martens, discussing the supply chain disruptions that face agriculture. Spokesman editor Dirk Steimel takes it from here.
First off, Bobby, can you give us some background on why we're seeing such severe supply chain issues now?
Yeah, thank you for having me, first of all. Oftentimes we'll see in the news that supply chains are broken or supply chains are out of whack, and supply chains are certainly very stressed right now. The reason they're very stressed right now primarily is because of the huge increase in durable spending that we're seeing globally, but especially right here in the United States. Durable spending from some of its lows last year is up well over 50%. That's a huge amount of product for supply chains to be able to absorb. Those supply chains are actually doing quite well to absorb this huge influx of product that is moving through them. But the supply chains weren't designed for the amount of product that is moving through them, or at least not designed to move that product through efficiently. So some of the major issues that we're seeing in global supply chains right now is very much related to just a sheer amount of product that we're trying to move through those chains.
For farmers, what are the biggest supply chain issues that are affecting them now, and what could affect them as they get ready to plant next spring?
I think for farmers, there's three major things that should be on their mind. Those really are fertilizer, crop protection, and equipment. Those three input areas for the farmers. Probably the three areas that are most out of the farmer's control, if you will. Right now, farmers are making tough decisions about what to do with fertilizer. Fertilizer prices are very high due to a number of factors, but also with crop protection, there's uncertainty about what chemicals may or may not be available for crop protection. And then there's the challenges with equipment. The backups at Long Beach and LA, many people have seen the number of ships, over 70 ships waiting to be unloaded. If there's equipment on those ships waiting to be unloaded, parts, the need to be unloaded that farmers are waiting for, those supply chains and those lead times are much longer than they used to be. So there could be some waiting that has to happen by farmers. We've kind of been accustomed to this Amazon type of a world where we order something now and we get it now. And that's not the world that we're operating in right now due to the stresses on our supply chains.
You mentioned fertilizer, and certainly farmers have seen those prices more than double from a year ago. Is that because of supply chain issues?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's 70 to 80% of the cost of producing fertilizer is natural gas, primarily natural gas. You can do it with any energy source. And we used to produce more nitrogen with coal before, but when natural gas became more abundant, most of our fertilizer is now produced with natural gas. The Caribbean, Russia, Ukraine, and China, and the U.S. are large producers of nitrogen fertilizer. So a big driver in the increase in the price of nitrogen is the natural gas price. Globally, we've seen natural gas prices go up very high. Some things going on in China are driving natural gas prices higher. The really quick manufacturing resurgence in China is taking more natural gas out of the market. In fact, the United States is exporting 17% is a number that I saw of our natural gas to China right now that we are producing. So that's an export market for us and is driving international markets. That being said, there have been some supply chain disruptions as well. We have China and to a lesser extent, Russia thinking about whether or not they even want to export the nitrogen fertilizer that they have. And that causes uncertainty in the market. We've also seen a couple issues with plants here in the United States not being able to produce as much as they maybe had wanted to or could. So there are multiple factors going into this. The biggest thing, I think, when you think about nitrogen fertilizer right now is we are very uncertain about where this market is going to go in the future because of the supply chain uncertainties, but also because of the natural gas uncertainties. Therefore, that uncertainty adds risk in the market. And anytime you have a risk added to the market, you have increased prices.
Bobby, you also mentioned equipment and crop protection supplies. Are those supply chain issues that are causing the concern about those? And are those likely to work themselves out by spring?
Yeah, I think those two are more caused by supply chain issues than the fertilizer challenge that we are facing itself. The fertilizer challenge is certainly large. It's the time of year to really be thinking about fertilizer. I think as we move into the spring, one of the bigger challenges are the two topics that we just talked about. You know, the price of used machinery has went through the roof, if anyone has followed that. And that's due to the chip shortages, the same type of challenges that automobile makers are facing when you drive by empty car lots. Machinery manufacturers are facing. And that's not just for new machinery, right? That can be for parts distribution, aftermarket parts that are needed to keep the machinery running, the planters, the harvest machinery, the tractors. And that one is tougher because that one has longer lead times. You're competing against others for the chips that go into it. And many of those parts and components, maybe not the end tractor itself, but many of the parts and components could be sitting on those ships off of LA and Long Beach, those backups that we're seeing. And there could be input challenges to being able to even produce some of those products. So with that being said, farmers should just be diligent and aware. Think about what they're ordering, think about what their needs are, work with their local equipment dealers, and understand what some of their challenges are. That's the best place to be able to look.
What about the strike at John Deere? Is that playing into this situation, Bobby?
At some point, the strike at John Deere may play into this situation. I am not close enough to some of the information and exactly what is being produced and not produced at John Deere to be able to say that. My instinct right now, my intuition tells me that the challenges with the equipment are less related to the strike at John Deere and are more related to sourcing of the equipment and the components and the parts that are coming into John Deere from a global perspective than the strike itself. Now, the one thing that we can think about, though, is our supply chains are really full right now. Overwhelmed is a word that you might want to say. I don't like the word broken because they are functioning, but these supply chains are very full. So anytime you see any type of disruption, including the strike at John Deere, that disruption can cause problems in the supply chain. Right? If the supply chain wasn't full right now, if this wasn't a time when we were seeing record consumer demand increases for durable goods, we were seeing large amounts of products moving our supply chain, we'd have more flexibility and agility in our supply chains to absorb shocks. Every shock that we see right now is hitting the news because our supply chains are so full of product that is moving. They're so stressed that those disruptions or those shocks that occur in our supply chains become very visible and apparent very quickly.
Are there steps that farmers could take or should look into taking to protect themselves against these supply chain issues, both in fertilizer, crop supplies, equipment, all of those things?
On the fertilizer topic, let's think about that first. I think that that's one of those where farmers need to take a hard look at what they're able to purchase and what makes sense for their operation. As they do that, purchasing very expensive fertilizer and pre-purchasing it especially means that they may wish to lock in prices for the future year, right? To be able to hedge their corn or their beans or the commodity prices coming out, because there's more risk than there has been before. When you think about that fertilizer supply chain, different members of that supply chain have to bear risk differently. One of the big questions becomes who in that supply chain is going to bear the price risk of fertilizer moving up or down, right? The downward risk for someone who owns that fertilizer could be more severe than the upward risk of what the price of fertilizer has done in the past. So someone has to bear that risk, and who bears that risk becomes a challenge. Does the farmer bear that risk? Does your local co-op or your intermediary bear that risk? Or is that risk borne by someone else in the supply chain? So that becomes a challenge. The next one we'll look at is crop protection. And let's think about crop protection for the upcoming growing season. Right now, I have no reason to believe that we're going to have large-scale shortages of any crop protection chemicals that are available. But our supply chains are very full. We've talked about this. This is going to take some time to create a new equilibrium, if you will, for our supply chains. And as we go through that time period to be able to create a new equilibrium, disruptions can create shortages very, very rapidly. So if I am producing crop protection, and I am a company producing crop protection, I want to work very closely with my suppliers, and I'm sure they are working very closely with the suppliers to understand their capabilities, to understand product lead times, and to understand when or if any disruptions do occur. At the local level for farmers, it's working to understand what products are available and maybe thinking about a backup plan. If I can't get the type of crop protection that I want, the type of chemical that I want to be able to put down, do I look to something else? Is there a substitute? It's maybe not a perfect substitute, but a substitute to what I would have purchased otherwise. Farmers also have the opportunity to pre-purchase some crop protection if they wish to, so that is an option that farmers can look at.
Building storage, and would that be a viable option for farmers in this situation?
I think storage for crop protection becomes really dependent upon what type of crop protection that you're looking at. It's hard to have huge amounts of glyphosate stored on a farm, perhaps. Farmers many times don't know what they'll need, especially if it's an insecticide for the growing season. It depends upon weather conditions, crop conditions. There's a lot of variability that goes into the demand side of what farmers are going to use. So if farmers are going to decide to store some amount of product, they would have some tough decisions to think about what they want to store, how they're going to go about storing that, and whether or not that is feasible for them to do. Now, some amount of storage may make sense for farmers to try to move that back. I don't think the farm groups, the farm industry wants to create our toilet paper problem that we all experienced during COVID-19, where everyone went out and stocked up on toilet paper, and we had TikToks on people doing things with toilet paper that are games, right? So playing games with this market doesn't help the market. That actually increases the vulnerability and the uncertainty that exists. So while that is an option, think about that carefully before moving into that option, I think.
How about keeping in close contact with your typical suppliers, your local co-op, your other farm supplier? Is that going to be important during this period?
That's critically important. And I think that farmers should be in contact. They should be in contact to understand parts distribution for their machinery. If there's critical components that they know are wear points on their machinery, they may want to think about those. They may want to think about preventative maintenance in a different way, or making sure the machinery is ready to go in the spring, because downtime is very expensive. And if we do see the supply chain issues continuing through spring, which we likely will see, very tight supply chains where we don't have a lot of excess capacity built into our supply chains, that is a possibility. I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying that it is a possibility. So farmers should also be in contact with their local cooperatives or intermediaries to be able to get a feel for what's happening. This is very dynamic. Things are changing very quickly in the supply chains right now for crop inputs in the types of things that we're talking about. So understanding those dynamic changes at the local level is very important. What is the cooperative able to source? What are they not able to source? What is your local equipment dealers able to source? What are they not able to source is important. Are there huge red flags for me right now in any of these? Not huge red flags, but we certainly don't want to be naive. We're in a time when these supply chains are very tight, and we have to think about contingency planning to be able to manage our risk. And that's what this really becomes for the farmers, is how do they manage their risk through a time that's much more uncertain on these crop input sides of things than it has been in the past.
One last question, Bobby. Kind of looking in your crystal ball, how long do you think these supply issues will remain? Are we a year along, 2 years along? How long do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question as well. And many different people have many different answers to that. I read a lot on this. I've been in supply chain and transportation for 25 years. I think that we will not see our supply chains reach a new equilibrium probably until 2023. So we're going to be in this world of supply chains having some challenges for some time. Are they going to be as challenged and as tight and as difficult to be able to operate as they are right now until 2023? Hopefully not, but it's going to take us time to reach a new equilibrium. One of the questions becomes is, what does that new equilibrium look like? Is this a new equilibrium where GDP growth stays high and we see fuel prices remain high and natural gas remains tight and we have ongoing higher fertilizer prices? Well, if that's our new equilibrium, I think we better get really quick at adopting some innovations in agriculture, right? And that's one of the great things that can come out of a challenge like this. The challenge is great, but one of the good things that can come out of a challenge like this is thinking about innovative ways to be able to use fertilizer, for instance, more wisely, innovative ways to be able to think about crop protection. It also allows us to step back and do a risk assessment on our supply chains. How many people in the world know all of the input providers for Roundup, right? Or any kind of chemical or herbicide that is being used on a field? Those input suppliers could be global. Is there risk associated with those input suppliers, and how much risk is associated? So I do think this is going to take some time. This isn't going to just end quickly. It's not going to be over immediately, but it gives us a new opportunity to be able to step back and think about our risk. For years, we've been thinking about how do we drive efficiency, drive out cost, drive efficiency in these supply chains. Maybe our tone is changing a little bit right now to where we're thinking about what risk exists in these supply chains. How do we manage that risk? And then as we're managing that, who pays for that risk management? Who bears that risk, and who ends up paying the extra cost associated with that risk? So even though we have some difficult times that we're facing right now and some uncertainty, perhaps is the better word of what we're facing right now, I hope we can take it and make some opportunities out of it as well.
As you can imagine, Dr. Martens' time is in pretty high demand right now, so we appreciate him taking the time to share his area of expertise with us. Certainly, this will be an area that we'll all be following very closely over the next several months. Now, let's turn to another topic that's top of mind for many of you, especially on the heels of harvest, and that's crop marketing. Starting November 18th, Iowa Farm Bureau will host a monthly webinar series that helps you build your crop marketing skills. The live webinar series will take place the third Thursday of each month from November through next April, with each webinar beginning at 1 p.m. Heading up that series is Ed Kordick, Iowa Farm Bureau's Farmer Education Program Manager. Spokesman reporter Tom Block recently sat down with Ed to discuss the series and why farmers need to get signed up now to make the most of the great information that will be shared over the next few months.
We're here with Ed Kordick, Iowa Farm Bureau's Farmer Education Program Manager, who's launching a series of webinars to help farmers learn more about crop marketing. Ed, tell us about the focus of these crop marketing webinars.
Well, we've just come out of a volatile year, and the crop is harvested now. So I always think about, what do you do with the crop now? And this is a first for me in the winter months, actually setting up a series of webinars that are built upon kind of each other, taking smaller pieces of education and breaking it out. So what I did was I worked with the University of Minnesota and their presentation, The 5 Common Mistakes in Grain Marketing. And to me, it fit really well seasonally with what we need to be thinking about each month during the winter. So every webinar, I plan to have an educational topic, and then I'll do a market update with cash, futures, and basis. And then I've created in a simulation some example players to illustrate some of the strategies. So each webinar will stand alone. They're not going to necessarily build on each other, but they will take that educational component and break it down to smaller segments.
Why are crop marketing skills and strategies so important for farmers in today's markets?
I think they're always important, but what we're coming off of, like I said, was a very volatile year. We'll probably have good returns in 2021 for the crop that we got harvested. But now, what do you do with it? And once it gets in the bin, I think emotions take over, and we need some type of a discipline to move those bushels to the market. So the goal of this series is to learn from history. If anyone's familiar with our efforts out there with winning the game, Barney Binless, Terry Timer, Peter Paper Farmer, some of those example people will show up again to show us how to use discipline and history in our marketings. And not only have margins been good in 2021, I think as we approach our marketing in 2022, we're all hearing that the margins are going to be much tighter. So it's a time to get back to the basics and try to mix in certain marketing tools in certain conditions.
Your webinars will get into the nuts and bolts of grain marketing decisions. Give us a sense for some of the detailed tips you're going to be offering farmers and why those tips are so important.
I think, like I said, it's seasonally. So the first one in November is going to be about, how do I make a decision? Do I store it, or do I sell cash and buy like a call option, or sell cash and buy futures? And that is touted sometimes as an example that really works every year, and I'm going to prove that it doesn't work every year. We need to think about the market conditions at the time, the basis, the carrying charge. So we're going to be doing some education around that. And then one of my favorite topics in January will be about selling pre-harvest bushels. So as I look out, are there margins above my example costs, and what can I do to price that seasonally? And we'll have a lot of fun with that, with some characters that I'll bring in, and we'll talk about comparisons versus history. And it really helps to make it a fun, entertaining way to educate, in addition to using the current markets to see how those strategies are working out in the 2021-22 crop year.
Overall, what do you hope that farmers will be able to take away from these webinars?
You know, for years I've taught about a disciplined approach, and I don't think we can predict markets, but I know that what we have is a market structure that tells us kind of what to do with crops. Is it always good to store the crop? Is it always good to sell cash and buy futures? Is it always good to, sell it out at harvest? I hope with these educational webinars, we're able to prove that no marketing tool is right all the time. You can't outguess the market, but a disciplined approach to marketing the crops using history, market structures, and each individual producer's costs and goals makes a lot of sense, especially as we enter into these volatile markets and volatile costs of production.
Ed, I know you're a baseball fan. One comparison I've heard is that you don't always have to hit home runs in grain marketing, but singles and doubles will win the game.
That's a really good analogy, Tom. I think that we tend to wait for that high in the market, and that's the home run. And if I never, as a farmer, sell at the high of the market, but I sell at a good price that makes me money, the goal is to farm next year and to survive, but then when there are good times and good margins, to thrive and take care of them. So I think that disciplined approach, hitting to the opposite field, bunting when we need to, taking a lot of different disciplined ways to approach the marketing challenge, I think that's very important.
And where can farmers go to find more information on these webinars and how to sign up?
Right at our website, iowafarmbureau.com. They're under trending topics. I hope all winter it'll be there. And once you sign up for one of these webinars, you are basically signed up for all 6 of them. So the first 5 will be short in nature, probably about a half hour. That last one in April, we're going to have a guest speaker, Ed Kordick from the University of Minnesota, to wrap it all up. So go to iowafarmbureau.com, sign up, you'll get reminders, and then you'll also get reminders for when that recording will be available. So that's important for those folks that can't make it at that webinar time.
All right, we appreciate that rundown from Ed. If you'd like to get registered for the new crop marketing series, which again starts on November 18th, we've included a link in the podcast notes. And while you're down there in the notes, be sure to check out our link to information about Iowa Farm Bureau's upcoming annual meeting, which is December 7th and 8th in Des Moines. You just heard Dr. Martens talk about the supply chain issues for farm equipment, and we don't have to tell you that the market for used farm equipment is crazy right now as well. So we're bringing in Machinery Pete, who's a nationally recognized expert in used farm equipment, to speak at our annual meeting. We'll also have a host of other experts on hand, giving presentations on topics that matter to your farming operation, and you'll also hear a keynote address from former U.S. Army Ranger Kenny Thomas, who was part of the 18-hour firefight that inspired the well-known book and movie Black Hawk Down. That's 2 days, December 7th and 8th, with a bunch of folks who live and breathe farming and agriculture just like you. You won't want to miss it, and again, be sure to click the link in the notes for this episode to get signed up before the registration deadline, which is November 22nd. That's all for this episode of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I hope you got some useful information and that you'll join us for our next episode on November 29th. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.